So for our capstone project, we set out to explore natural carbon solutions for UNH. My name is Clay Weber.
I'm Ethan McDonough.
I'm Kaitlin Houle.
And I'm Gendreau, and we were mentored by Jennifer Andrews.
So carbon sequestration is vegetation's natural process of converting carbon in the atmosphere to biomass through photosynthesis. Now, we set out to explore 3 nature-based carbon sequestration techniques that UNH can feasibly implement across its 3 campuses or through partnerships to best meet emission reduction goals as established by WildCap.
So the first technique we looked at was land preservation, in which plants, trees, and ecosystems are protected, which enables them to keep sequestering carbon, pulling it from the atmosphere. But it also protects stored carbon that's already in roots and in the plant systems through avoided conversion. So essentially making sure that a forest stand doesn't become a development. And some universities that have implemented this are UNH Forestry, which protects a series of ecosystems on campus and off campus. Dickinson University has begun a program where they sell carbon offsets to support a land preserve that's about 80 miles off their campus. And then the University of Edinburgh in UK is working on a direct carbon offset program in which they would have full ownership of some land preservations. And then urban forestry is the next technique we looked at, which is similar to land preservation in the sense that it utilizes plants and trees to sequester carbon, but different in the sense that it builds that into the built environment. So it's an afforestation method specifically with trees, and it also provides a host of co-benefits for both plants, animals, which includes humans. And then some implementation. Arizona State University runs an urban forestry program on their campus. The Yale Urban Resource Initiative does urban forestry in a variety of towns, including New Haven. And then Brookings Urban Forest Initiative, which has been kind of like on the foreground of this work, and they provide direction for other universities who are interested in urban forestry. And then finally, we have mass timber and wood products, which differs in the sense that it sequesters carbon by capturing it and storing it in raw lumber material, as well as like wood products that can be used for ornamental decoration or furniture. And it preserves the carbon by turning it into this long-lasting resource. It also makes sure that forests and woodlands can also remain as an economic resource for the school or institution that's using them. But there is some current issues right now trying to figure out the best way to harvest the lumber in a sustainable fashion that doesn't also produce emissions. Some universities and institutions that have implemented this are Michigan State Sustainable Wood Recovery Program, which actually harvests urban forestry wood and then turns that into wood products and timber that they use for repairs and new construction. And then the Oregon Forest Resource Institute, which has been recording stored carbon in wood products since 1996.
So our approach to this project began with secondary research. We focused on peer-reviewed science journals, reports from governmental agencies, and also looking at other universities and municipalities who have implemented different plans, programs, and policies to work towards carbon sequestration and reaching carbon neutrality. We also conducted some interviews focusing in on the UNH Forestry Department, UNH Cooperative Extension, and also with the Town of Durham Land Management to get a better idea of how this would take place at UNH.
For this project, we also used several digital tools to get some quantified results. These included the New Hampshire Forest Disturbance Risk Map by John Gunn, iTree Canopy, and the EPA Greenhouse Gas Equivalency Calculator. The disturbance map showed us the carbon stocks around New Hampshire and how they can be impacted by increased conservation and other risk factors such as invasive species. Secondly, iTree Canopy was used to measure tree cover in specific areas. And lastly, with the EPA Greenhouse Gas Equivalency Calculator, we input UNH's different carbon outputs to see how much forested land would be required to store the carbon. This is an example of the New Hampshire Forest Disturbance Risk Map. These maps show where the most carbon is stored across the state and where the most and least conservation occurs across the state. Red would be the least and green would be the most conservation. Southern New Hampshire is actually is where the most carbon is stored in New Hampshire, and is also where the least conservation is happening. For our results, the table shows the different carbon outputs by UNH and how much forest would be required to sequester these outputs. It's also important to remember that as of 2021, UNH Forest had the capacity to sequester around 4,800 metric tons of carbon. That's quite the gap, looking at the total amount of carbon outputs by the university. On the left is the carbon outputs table represented graphically, and on the right is the total land needed to sequester UNH's carbon represented visually. It's a huge chunk of land. Okay, this table compares the different methods and their various components. Looking at land preservation, it has cost New Hampshire as a whole $267 million in land preservation from 1998 to 2017. And the cost per acre is $207.72. It would take 49,298 acres to sequester all of the outputs on UNH's main campus in Durham.
And when we looked at potential partnerships for land preservation, we highlighted the town of Durham through a meeting with their land preservation coordinator, and he mentioned that maybe there could be a chance that UNH could engage in like direct sequestration by working with the town, preserving forest lands, but then the other options would be working with nonprofits that help universities fund land preservation efforts off campus. And then there's a host of co-benefits that come with land preservation. Most importantly, enhanced biodiversity for plants and animals, which is important in the fight against climate change, but also air, water filtration, and recreational space for humans.
So moving on to urban forestry, we focused in on the Scope 3 emissions, and using the EPA equivalency calculator, we found that we would need to plant around 105,000 seedlings and grow them for 10 years to sequester all of that carbon. And using the prices from the New Hampshire State Forest Nursery, we found that the base cost would be around $147,000, and that's not including the costs that would rise over the 10 years from maintenance, transportation, and planting. And since Scope 3 is so huge, and that is a lot of trees, to give you an idea of scale, it's about 65 trees planted for every residential home in Durham. Looking at a smaller portion of Scope 3, which would be transmission and distribution, that would only require 3,000 seedlings to be planted, which is closer to 3 trees per house in Durham.
And again, with partnerships, we highlighted working with the town of Durham and both planning and implementing urban forestry or green space initiatives. Also working with UNH Cooperative Extension and maybe some offsite areas, and then the state of New Hampshire with their nursery program to get the seedlings and tree saplings. And then again, with co-benefits, urban forestry provides a great deal of co-benefits, including green space in the built environment, as well as mitigation of extreme weather events like extreme heat or flooding. And then finally, it has a lot of positive mental and physical outcomes for humans.
Mass timber differs from the previous two plans in that beyond a few initial investments like machinery and transportation, it actually has the potential to create revenue for UNH. And while it certainly has the ability to sequester carbon, the entire process is really bogged down by inefficient transportation techniques, wasteful lumbering, and if we are able to make it more efficient, we can sequester a lot of carbon in the future. If the lumbering industry were to enter a sustainability-minded transformation, it could be in the future a really good method for UNH. Partnerships would include industrial wood mills and transportation companies, and along with the listed co-benefits, the main one would be revenue from the sale of wood products.
So just to summarize our results, we found that a combination of all 3 of these approaches would most likely be necessary to offset all of UNH's emissions. However, we feel that land preservation and urban forestry are the best options just due to their applications and their co-benefits. There are some limitations, including the impending impacts of climate change and how that would affect the trees that would be planted and which types of trees would be planted, and also just the scale required to sequester all of those emissions through just natural solutions isn't really feasible.
And then through our investigation of those 3 techniques, we also highlighted some areas of future research which we believe UNH should look into. The first being investment in blue and teal carbon. So blue carbon is carbon sequestered by aquatic environments. Teal carbon, carbon sequestered by aquatic mixed with terrestrial. So that would be like estuaries, wetlands, bogs. And we actually found that these environments might have the capacity to sequester more carbon than a forest stand or a garden or whatnot. So we think that there should be a solid assessment of UNH's wetlands and bogs because we do preserve a couple of them. And then also look into the effectiveness of artificial wetlands, which would be implemented in urban forestry, as well as the evaluation that we conducted on those other techniques. So cost, co-benefits, feasibility. And then finally, some research into implementation before any of this stuff moves forward. So that would be working, like figuring out which nonprofits would be best for land preservation. There's been some concerns about how effective the offset program actually is when you're working with nonprofits on offsite areas, and then as well as approaches to maybe working with private landowners who do own a lot of the forested land in New Hampshire. And then finally, transdisciplinary approaches for urban forestry and green spaces, because there needs to be all stakeholders involved when you implement that into a community, and there is some negative impacts if it's not planned accordingly. So, yeah.
We appreciate your time and we look forward to answering your questions.